I'll never forget, I think maybe Vertigo or the second picture, and Hitch was sitting in his chair, you know, with his lip out and this and that, and I said, Hitch, what are you thinking about? And Hitch says, I'm thinking about my next film. This is all terribly boring.
Hitchcock always said he was bored making a movie. The notion that he simply sat back in a chair and drew everything and then slept on the set was very useful at intimidating people who wanted to interfere with his work. I went into writing Hitchcock at Work believing that myth, but I had heard all of these other things about him that indicated that it was more like a bunch of kids in the backyard making a movie. That's what it was, or an independent production. I said, did anybody ever bother you from the studio? Were the unions ever a problem? Nothing. Well, I'll tell you one thing, no storyboards have ever been found for Hitchcock out of England. He was introduced to the concept by David O. Selznick, who had used them on Gone with the Wind to try to control the directors. It's a producer's idea. The producer doesn't go on the set, but he wants to be able to control what happens on the set. How's he going to do it? You have William Cameron Menzies draw every angle for you. And then Hitchcock sort of took them over and used them for all sorts of purposes, including PR, educating people. You see, this is the shot, this is the image that I had in my mind, and so on. He really took them away from the producer and made them a tool of the director. That's one of the things I learned fairly recently.
David O. Selznick worked with Hitchcock before, and he greatly admired Hitchcock. But he didn't like Hitchcock's angular cutting, he didn't like the POV stuff, as simple as that. Some of the things that Hitchcock were doing were definitely not conventional. And also the pacing that those things created, because it almost automatically slows it down. Selznick didn't like any of these kind of techniques.
Feel better?
That overall general tension between a director, producer, and studio led many of the better camera-style directors, and like Michael Curtiz, and they would cut in camera. And what that means is they would only shoot the shot they needed. The other option is to have coverage. So you shoot multiple things. Now the editor gets all this stuff, and he has 5 options. I'll give you a little John Ford story. He was being interviewed, and from his own movie, and they said, well, why did you shoot that character so far away from camera and not use the close-up? And he said, because then the studio would have used it. Hitchcock, even more than most, he didn't just camera cut. Hitchcock gave them no options. That was why the whole point of doing every single panel, that was the shot. And when someone said, well, can we move here? And they would say, no, that's the shot. That's all we have. That's all we shot that day. But we know it works because it's here on the storyboard. Okay, I'm reading from this book, Truffaut, Hitchcock. It's a classic. And Hitchcock and Truffaut are discussing Notorious.
Notorious.
Moi, c'est pratiquement le film que je préfère de tous les noirs et blancs.
Probably the picture which I prefer of all the black and whites.
C'est la quintessence d'Hitchcock.
It's the quintessence of Hitchcock to me. It's perhaps a picture where one senses that
Colle exactement.
That everything fits in. There's least overlapping. Everything fits
avec
in
ce qui
exactly
est prévu.
as
Et
you
avec
plan
les
it.
dessins aussi.
And with the drawings as well.
Ça ne serait pas plus précis en dessin animé.
That is, that in an animated cartoon it couldn't have been more precise.
No, when it was economic, that's true.
C'était économique, c'est vrai.
In Notorious, one of the things that was most interesting to me was the sequence where Elisa comes to the house for the first time and she's introduced to the mother.
Good evening. I'm Miss Huberman. Will you tell Mr. Sebastian that I'm here?
That whole section shows a use of POV that's very, very unique and interesting. One of the great shots is when the mother makes a grand entrance down a staircase, and this is all very carefully designed. She's probably 60 feet away, and until she comes into a close-up right in front of the camera, she doesn't blink once. That is predator behavior.
Please forgive me for keeping you waiting.
Not at all.
May I take your ride?
Another very interesting scene is the shot where she comes in to meet the four Nazi conspirators. They're in a drawing room, it's very formal, and they each come up and kiss her hand. Very European, continental in the day. And the way they shot that was kind of looks like an over-the-shoulder shot, but it's not. Insofar, it's almost a POV shot. And so each man comes down and kisses her hand, but they're very close. That was also unusual. It's almost invading the normal space that was a convention, meaning the size of the shot and how people got close to each other. It violates that, and it's way too intimate as they kiss her hand. So it's a little bit creepy, which was intentional.
Dr. Anderson.
It's not a full POV shot because the actors don't actually ever look up into the camera. So they're looking a little bit to the side, but I would still call that a modified POV shot. You got their look, but you never do the reverse to Elisa, and what that provides is she's even more powerful not being in the shot than if they had done the reverse, because that's a release. So the whole time the audience is conditioned after years of watching cinema that you would expect this cut, and they never get it. And so instead, they're thinking Elisa's right here, she's right here the whole time, but she's not even in the shot.
The Birds and Marnie were the most intensively subjective films he had made, and The Birds even more than Marnie, because it's all Tippy's point of view. It's the visual language of cinema, which Hitchcock helped invent, and which everybody is still using. The lake crossing scene in The Birds. It's done entirely as a subjective sequence, except for two shots. The shot when she is inside the house and she puts the cage down, that is the first, you could call it, objective shot in the sequence. And the shot when she looks off to the side and sees the gull approaching. You actually see the gull for a second. But Hitchcock explained that. He said, I always try to go with the subjective, but in that case I had to go with the objective because otherwise people might just think it was a piece of paper that blew across the frame. So I had to have her look, see the bird, and then have the bird attack, and that's like a big break in the sequence too. But it was something that he did out of always thinking about how the audience was going to see, understand, and react to the image. He had it in his mind, and I think it was Harold who said to me, he claimed that he could see the whole film in his head, and I think he could, which doesn't mean that he didn't change it on the set. What I learned from Harold was that the storyboards were really just the beginning of the process. He always said that storyboards are a suggestion.
Well, I was given the script, a certain part of the script, and told to do a storyboard on the script. I proceeded to do it, and I got some great ideas, and I got very excited, and I did this script. I was so proud of it. Now, when we went to see Hitch, he looked at it and said, "This is really very good. This is really very good, but I can't use it here." And I thought to myself, boy, this is a rejection if there ever was one. And when I went back to the art department, I realized, reading the rest of the script, that this was an anticlimax, and this was no way you do a picture, because a picture is like a symphony, is like music. It builds up, it goes down. You're the composer. You have complete control over the music and the emotions that it gives forth. And so in this case, he was absolutely right, and I found out he was absolutely right in many cases.
Hitchcock was very good at making clear what he wanted to have on film. And as Harold here knows, if you didn't get it, you weren't around long. The shower scene, you know, that Saul Bass took all the credit for. But once Hitchcock says, I want to have a scene in which we don't see a nude woman, we don't see a knife enter flesh, and we'll do it in quick cuts. And I thought, you know, after somebody tells you that, the rest is just work. You
draw it up.
You do it. And that's why I always felt that Saul Bass took a little too much credit for that scene.
Yeah, he was going to show Hitchcock how to do it.
Yeah, well, he did the continuity, but gee, that's...
With every stroke she shed a tear, resulting...
Well, I can tell you what Hitchcock said. He said, what we will do, this before we shot, he said, we'll bring Melanie out. She's very relaxed. Nothing is troubling anybody, particularly, and she comes over and sits down by a fence that was along here, a rail fence, I think, or whatever it was. And she sat there and smoked a cigarette. And Hitchcock said, we'll just get a loose shot of her as she comes out, sits down, and then we'll become aware of a bird flying in and landing on the jungle gym. We go back to Melanie a little closer this time, and she's still relaxed. We cut away, another bird comes in. We repeat this several times, and each time the camera's moving in closer. And when we finally get to a big head choker, we'll let the camera stay on Melanie until they can't stand it anymore.
A lot of the indications for how an action scene would be done would appear in the storyboards, not in the script. A Hitchcock script was a pretty simple thing.
Storyboarding is writing in a lot of ways. You're telling more of the story through the visuals in a film than you are through the dialogue necessarily, and at least ideally that would be the case, and certainly that was the case for somebody like Hitchcock. The storyboards are a working document that the crew can look at, but really they're sort of a visual screenplay.
Well, actually, you see, this is not the script. This is pure Hitchcock. The script doesn't say that these are individual shots. Hitchcock put them up and slides. He would show them on a screen, and the editor, Tomasini, and Hitch and myself were in this room. And he was cutting it by calling out how many frames he wanted. He would say to the editor, 12 frames, and the editor would take it down, a foot of film or whatever, and he actually sat there in the screening room and edited this whole sequence. And he would see these quick cuts of absolute terror with blood running down and her screaming and everything. And by God, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That was Hitchcock. I was there. It was amazing.
Working on Saboteur, I learned a lot about the Hitchcock way of thinking. I won't call it a learning about the rules. He didn't have too many rules. But I learned how he thought. I know he was called the master of suspense. But really, it was the master of the kind of suspense that we all feel in our daily lives.
Within a minute.
And he made you identify with it by the way he shot it. And I think that's what I learned about it. I learned to be able to think of it more in terms of the human values.
It's not that I don't.
What you became more interested in is how a man's hands trembled when he was about to do something.
I'm very contrite.
Hitchcock made the audience identify with what was going on the screen. What happens to the smallest thing that happens on a set, which can sometimes be more important than the flashier aspects of filmmaking. It's in the minor details that we found
suspense.